Welcome, Professor Jo Phoenix, to the Women's Rights Network podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a professor of criminology, which is actually a bit of a misnomer because I'm actually a sociologist. But I've spent 26 years studying issues of violence against women and youth justice, strangely. So I started a long time ago studying prostitution. I've looked at child sexual exploitation, all sorts of things, fairly grim topics. As a professor, I am responsible for all sorts of things, not just teaching and not just research, but also something called research capacity building, which is where you bring people together. And up until just a few years ago, I had a reasonable reputation, if you like, in a fairly small pond that had to do with academia and policy in these very specific areas. But in December of 2019, I was due to give a seminar on trans rights in female prisons at Essex University. And sadly, that seminar got cancelled and I got blacklisted from the university. The cancellation and my blacklisting in December of 2019 attracted some attention from the media. Yeah, namely because cancelling seminars and cancelling academics and certainly blacklisting them from universities goes against pretty much every single academic ethic and value that you can imagine. We have something called academic freedom, and it's a responsibility of universities to make sure that academics can test commonly accepted ideas. And that seminar was just going to actually look at this conflict of rights that we've been seeing around transgender individuals and sex-based rights or trans rights and sex rights. The Reindorf report was a very important report. It was conducted by Aqua Reindorf, KC, and she looked at what had happened to the cancellation and blacklisting of me and another academic, a woman called Professor Rosa Freeman. And that report basically said that what happened to the both of us was unlawful. And off the back of that and the Maya Forstater ruling, which both of them came within weeks of each other, I set up something called the Open University Gender Critical Research Network. At that time, I was working for the Open University. The Gender Critical Research Network, the idea of that was really to bring together across the country, or even internationally, what we might call gender critical researchers. Those people being academics who start from the premise that sex matters, and that we just need to figure out where, when, why, and how biological sex might matter more than gender identity. Well, when that happened, the entire university pretty much went into a paroxysm, and I and the other members of the network became subject to an online and at-work harassment campaign calling for discrimination against us. And within days of us establishing that network, there was a petition signed by 360 academic staff from the Open University calling for the university to disaffiliate itself from us, the network. Well, this is a really interesting to me, because of course, I only do that work because I'm an employee. So to ask my employer to disaffiliate itself from me is in effect asking for direct discrimination against a particular member of staff on the basis of their gender critical views. Anyway, we fast forward in time a little bit more. It got very, very difficult for me to stay at the OU because the OU failed to do anything about the harassment. Arguably, they colluded in some of it. It got to a point where I realized that there was no place in the university that wasn't touched by these accusations of being a Holocaust denier or, being likened to Nazis, just awful, awful stuff, and being told that I was transphobic. So I left, and I am currently working as the deputy head of the law school at the University of Reading, which is great. It's a fantastic job. But I've also taken the OU to court, to an employment tribunal. And At present, the trial is due to happen on October the 2nd of 2023. It's scheduled for between 11 and 15 days. It's going to be a very grueling affair. As I understand it, I will be on the witness stand for 2, possibly 3 days.
Oh my goodness.
I know. Yeah, it's a long and grueling affair. The Open University are calling 18 witnesses against me.
18.
18.
18. Oh my word.
Yeah, 18
Is that
witnesses.
some sort of tactical thing to make
well,
it go
I mean,
on for longer and cost you more? And
no,
18?
I think, yeah, it does make a sense. So there are about 18 people I named in my grounds of claim. So if you name somebody, you've got to give them a chance then to defend what they did, what they said. And I feel fairly sanguine about it now. When I realized they were going to do that a year ago, it sent me into a bit of a tailspin. But now I feel fairly sanguine about it because, if nothing else, it's 18 opportunities for them to be cross-examined.
Sorry, I can't help it. Okay, yeah, great.
Yeah,
good.
But
by
yeah,
whom? Who do we know who you've got yet? Are you allowed to say?
I am allowed to say it is the amazing Ben Cooper.
Excellent.
The other thing about that 18 witnesses, of course, is you could argue that it's a form of economic intimidation, because what should have been a relatively short, i.e. around 10-day trial, suddenly turned into up to 15 days, which is, half again as much money that it's going to cost me.
Good point.
Yeah, so it's a long and torturous thing. And, if people want to hear more about it or see more about it, they can Google me on YouTube. I've got a lot of talks about it, but they can also read about it on my Crowd Justice Fund page, which hopefully you'll be able to give them the link on the podcast.
Absolutely. We'll bob that in the description. So if anybody can afford to, please do contribute to your crowdfunder. And for those who can't, and we appreciate that, please do share.
Yes, absolutely. And, I have to say something about this. The last 18 months since I launched the Crowd Justice Funder has been some of the most humbling times of my life. Reading the comments on the Crowd Justice Funder, there were so many people that have contributed only, and I say only to put it in context, only around £3 to £5. And the comments that they make are things like, sorry, that's not more. And yet to me, I think, oh my goodness, that person is probably struggling with the cost of living crisis.
Yes.
They may have found that £3 or £5 by, looking back at the back of the cushions in the sofa, something like that. And the fact that they're willing to give that makes me feel both humble, but also I take very seriously my responsibility to make sure that I do everything I can to win that case. It's very simple. Other people have trusted their very hard-earned money in the hopes that we actually can produce some change in universities.
I can't imagine where you find the time to have to get everything together ready for that, and your full-time job, and you've written a report published by the Women's Rights Network this week. It's called When We Are at Our Most Vulnerable, the Sickening Extent of Rapes and Sexual Assaults in Hospitals. How did that come about?
Well, actually, partly for me by happenstance. So I am a member of the Women's Rights Network academic unit. And I think it was either through that or another women's rights WhatsApp group. Somebody had mentioned something about doing an FOI for police forces for exactly this, rapes and sexual assaults in hospitals. And when I saw that, it was just one of those moments where you think, oh gosh, that's actually really important. And as a criminologist, of course, I study the administration of criminal justice. And so as soon as I saw that, I thought, you know what, I have expertise here. There's not a lot. I wish I could do more for a lot of the organizations that I'm a member of, but I thought I can do this. I can help shape this. So members of the Women's Rights Network have done just the most extraordinary amount of heavy lifting for that report. They're the ones who collected the data. They're the ones who made the freedom of information requests. They're the ones who kept going back when police forces didn't respond. They're the ones who actually wrote the questions themselves. And when a lot of the data came in, one of the members contacted me and said, well, we've got the data. Can you do something with it? And I said, yes. And then I sat on it for a week. And I sat on it for a week because I couldn't believe the numbers. I literally could not believe the numbers. I mean, it's not like we haven't known about this. There have been stories about this since about 2007. There was even a media reporting about it. I can't remember which newspaper, last November, only 6 months ago. And yet, for some reason, it just wasn't taking off as a story. And I kept thinking, okay, these numbers are horrendous. Over 6,500 rapes and sexual assaults since 2019, January 1st, 2019, until the end of September, effectively, 2022, with 2,088 rapes within hospital premises. When I looked at that, I thought, how can we begin to explain this? And then I thought, actually, it's not so much the explanation, because let's face it, sexual violence against women and girls and some men is endemic, and it's routine. And why would we necessarily think that all the people who are in hospitals are not sexual offenders? Right? I mean, we just kind of think that, don't we? We think, okay, a hospital is a place of safety. So I want to talk a little bit about where the title came from, right? And this is, if you don't mind, this is a personal story. Many years ago, I was working at Durham University. This is, about 10 years ago in my professional life, maybe even a little bit more. And I had a terrible accident, right? I was walking along a very icy street and I fell. And my left leg went out in front of me. My right leg went out behind me, and I fell over my front leg. And I obtained a stage 3 or grade 3 tear in my hamstrings. That's a very big tear.
People can't see it, but I am wincing.
It was awful. And I couldn't even get up from the fall. And I lay on the ice for 3 hours until the ambulance came. Well, our NHS system has been in crisis for a very long time.
Yes.
It was cold. People were bringing me cups of tea, which was good. Anyway, I went to hospital, various things happened, and then eventually a few weeks later, I was referred to the physiotherapy up in that region. I won't name the hospital, but I was referred to physiotherapy up there. And I had my first physiotherapy appointment. And I went in, it was a male physiotherapist, and he asked me to get undressed and lay down on my face on the bed. Now, all of that is perfectly within keeping. The guy had to see the back of my leg, and the tear was right up, and forgive me for being fairly detailed, but the tear was right up at the bottom of my buttock, if you know what I mean. And it went down. So I got undressed. I think I had a gown. I can't remember. I certainly had my underwear on. And as he was looking at my leg and he was touching it, he slipped his hand underneath my knicker elastic. Right. And it wasn't the sort of thing that you would say, oh my God, he's sexually assaulting me. It was like, what? Was that I mean, the fact that I can't even get words out isn't because I'm distressed. It's because I'm trying to capture the absolute shock that I felt at what was happening. And I kind of squirmed and moved around and made sure that his hand wasn't near my knickers anymore. Until I saw that data, until that day, all I had was this really uncomfortable feeling about what had happened. And this question, was that a sexual assault or not? It was certainly inappropriate touching. And then as I was thinking about it with the data, I was like, inappropriate touching is a sexual assault. And to me, I was like, oh my God. And literally all I thought was that happened when I was at my most vulnerable, which is where the title, came from for that report. So what then happened? Well, the women of the Women's Rights Network did a phenomenal job of number crunching, the database that we had. And I thought, actually, what we need to do is frame that in terms of hospital governance. What should have happened? So going back to that instance where I was lying on the bed in a physiotherapy department, what should have happened to stop that person doing that, right? There should have been more than him and me, right?
Yes.
There should have been a woman present. There should have been a question about, are you okay if I touch you here? Right? There should have been all manner of things that weren't there. So that then got me looking at the Care Quality Commission, which is the governing body, if you like. It's the inspector for what happens in our social care and hospital system. And I realized that this is not a new story. The Care Quality Commission have been talking about sexual violence in residential, usually mental health wards and social care settings since 2017. So I started reading all of those reports. And then I realized that actually, even though they were even in one of those reports, were reporting a vicious rape of an older woman in a social care setting, that the commission and the NHS Foundation trusts were framing the issue not as sexual violence and the prevention of sexual violence, but actually how to promote sexual safety. This is
an odd way to frame it.
Well, you'd think that, but and this is where it comes back to having done work in this area for 26 years. It's not the first time that has happened, right? We don't talk generally about sexual safety and sexual well-being, not outside GU clinics and things like that. But if you think about what happens when, there's a serial rapist afoot, you get the police saying, women, you must stay home.
Like the Yorkshire Ripper in Leeds.
Got it. Yeah, exactly. So then when you look at those sexual safety policies that the NHS Foundation trusts have, you see exactly the same framing. If you feel uncomfortable, you can talk to somebody about it. If you feel that you are at risk, you can talk to somebody about it. And of course, at that point, I'm like, oh, I've seen this narrative before. I've seen this way of framing it before. It's about making the victim take responsibility for what happened and then for also reporting it, which is a real problem, I think. We need to act, and that's one of the calls for action, is actually getting hospitals to take seriously their responsibility for this. The other thing that was very apparent was that the sexual safety policies were really more targeted at reporting and recording structures. So if somebody has had a sexual safety incident, right, that's the language that's used, there is A, B, and C process for reporting and recording it, right? And of course it involves, the local adult safeguarding or child safeguarding.
Yeah.
But nowhere did I see in any of those policies, and here's how you might help the victim report it to the police, right? Which is, that's something in and of itself. I know as an academic, if a young woman comes into my office, one of my tutees or something, and says, I was raped last week by X, the very first thing I say is, are you okay? The second thing I say is, have you thought about reporting it to the police? And do you want me to come with you?
Yeah.
It makes sense, doesn't it? So that was one whole line of thinking. And we tried to capture that in the report a little bit. I didn't want to drown the poor readers of the report with all of the academic stuff in there. And I just thought it was nice to frame it by, this is how it's looked at by the inspector. But there's another bit. The FOIs have showed that the state of our recording of these things is in a shocking mess. quite frankly.
Mhm.
The fact that we've had to use an FOI to get where rapes take place in and of itself is a bit worrying. But the fact that we haven't got, things like the sex of the victim, the sex of the perpetrator, or more importantly for this context, was it a patient? Was the victim a patient? Was the victim a member of staff? Was the victim, we've got the hospital ward data, but are they in a geriatric ward? Are they in a mental health ward? Are they in a pediatric ward? Or are they just in a physiotherapy department?
Yeah.
And nor do we have anything about the perpetrators of these, crimes.
Right.
We don't know if they're staff. We don't know if they're doctors, clinicians, healthcare. What do they call them? Healthcare assistants. We know pretty much nothing. Which, given that NHS Foundation trusts have now a responsibility for reporting and recording this information, and once it's gone to the police to be reported, we ought to know more.
Yes.
So that's another call to action is basically try and get the police to take seriously their responsibilities here and to get some joined up, for lack of better words, joined up communication and information flows. Because if you don't know the extent of the problem and you don't have its full dimensions, you can't do anything about it. It's really simple.
And why are the police failing to record that data?
I don't think they're failing to record it, right? What I think they're failing to do is record it in a form that is easily accessible. So I think that the police have all of that data, but they'd have to go through the case files to extract it.
Understood.
Yeah. Which, that will be a lot of police forces going, oh, this is far too expensive, right? Now, can we just divert out for a little bit here, because there's something else that we said and wanted to really press in the report, and that's this thing that hospitals aren't somewhere else. Now, where did that come from? The British Crime Survey, the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is a survey of victims predominantly, collected information about rape and penetrative sexual assaults, and they broke down these occurrences according to place. And the place was in a perpetrator's home, in the victim's home, in a park, in a pub, in a car park, and somewhere else.
Quite broad.
Quite broad. They also had university and education as a separate, university and schools as a separate category. Now, for the years 2016, pretty much through to 2022, the somewhere else sat fairly consistently at around 19% of the rapes that people were talking about, right? So this is a fairly substantial amount of victims reporting the rapes that they had that took place somewhere else. I tried to figure out where the somewhere else could be that wasn't already on the list, and I could only think of two places: hospitals and police stations. I mean, I'm pausing there for dramatic effect on purpose here. So what the police forces are failing to record and make public, if you like, is where these rapes and sexual assaults are happening. Now, this comes back to something very important about rape myths. Right? We've got a lot of rape myths around, she asked for it, she was wearing the wrong thing, all these things that feminists have been
putting
fighting.
It on the victim.
Yeah, putting it on the victim. Men can't help themselves. These are things that we've had to fight against for at least 50 years. And feminists and activists have been doing a good job of trying to break down those rape myths. One of those rape myths, though, is that rape by a stranger or rape outside of a domestic or a dating situation is relatively rare. Right? And it's an important message to give that out, that it's relatively rare. But what we're beginning to see is that rapes in some very specific types of institutions that are mixed sex may not be as rare as we think. Yeah.
When it's a 19% figure.
Quite. quite. So I think one of the unintended consequences of really trying to hammer home that rape is very routine and it's in our kind of own personal settings, and that you're far more likely to be raped by somebody that you know or you're dating, or sexually assaulted by someone that you know or you're dating. That's been a great campaign, but I think we need to now press against those someplace else's and start thinking about intimate settings where people are vulnerable for one reason or another, whether it's medically or because of their background, and where it's mixed sex. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to get out of the report, or one of the messages I wanted to get out is, this isn't about people. It's clearly about rape and sexual assault, but it's about how we manage the routineness of this in our public institutions.
It is absolutely shocking.
So some of the reactions that we've got to the report have been illuminating to me, and they have piqued my curiosity as an academic and somebody very concerned with protecting women's sex-based rights. I had an email, I won't mention who it's from, but the email basically said that this individual had been a nurse on a maternity ward for 43 years, right? And when she first started nursing, you couldn't have a single male with a female, regardless of how either of them identify, alone together in any setting, right? So there always had to be another woman present. However, she saw over the last 10 to 15 years the complete erosion of that, partly because of staffing difficulties, but also, and I hate to say it, because of issues around gender identity. Particularly when we start talking about, as these sexual safety policies talk about, single gender wards rather than single sex wards. But again, to come to some personal experience, last year I had the misfortune of having to have a shoulder operation. And it was fine. It was a standard operation. I woke up, I was hopped up to the eyeballs on morphine as a painkiller, and I needed a wee. But there wasn't a female healthcare assistant who could escort me to the toilet.
Really?
There just wasn't one on staff at that point. When the male healthcare assistant came, it wasn't, I hate to say, a private hospital. When he came, I said, no, really, I don't want you. I want a woman. And he said, well, you're going to have to wait for 2 hours until one comes on shift. I'm like, yeah, can't.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a big problem.
And it would appear we've learned nothing from Savile either. That was one of the biggest scandals we've ever had.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. I really am. I was watching a documentary just a couple of days ago about Savile, and then I went and read the Savile report the day before we launched our report. And reading that made me think, oh my goodness, he started in Stoke Mandeville Hospital as a volunteer porter. A porter, right? And then suddenly I was thinking, we have learned absolutely nothing. But we've taken our eye off the ball, quite frankly. We assumed that Savile was a one-off, and as this report shows so clearly, this is not a one-off situation.
Thank you for listening to the Women's Rights Network podcast. We are women volunteers fighting for the sex-based rights of women and girls. If you'd like to join WRN, please head over to womensrights.network and click Get in Touch. Join WRN. You'll be very welcome. Now, let's get back to Professor Jo Phoenix. One of the really interesting sections of the report is something called attrition rates. Can you tell us what that is and then what the report says?
Yes, absolutely. So attrition rate is a term that we use to talk about the number of cases that fall out of a system. So if you think about the processing of a criminal case, any case. You've got to have a victim you've got to have a crime that takes place. So you have to have a law in place for something to happen, right? I mentioned that specifically because, of course, it took until 1992 for rape to be made illegal in marriage. So you have to have a law in place. Then you have to have a victim. That victim has to realize that something has happened to them. Right? We go back to that example I gave you of me in the physiotherapy ward. I didn't realize something had happened to me.
Yeah.
And then you have to have a victim who's prepared to go to the police and say what has happened. Now, the moment that that victim goes to the police, an incident, whatever crime it is recorded, right? Or the reporting takes place. We've got a record in the system. This crime was reported, right? And then it will get recorded. The police may choose not to record it for a whole variety of reasons. And in fact, until 10 or 15 years ago, the recording rules were that you didn't have to record a prima facie thing. You could use a police judgment. So the police might turn around and say, it was a domestic. We're not going to record it. Yeah, but that doesn't happen anymore. They have to make an entry at the point that a victim reports something. Then it gets recorded as a particular type of crime. And then you can track it through the whole criminal justice system. So, if it's been recorded, is there a charge or a summons, right? If you've got a charge or a summons, does the Crown Prosecution Service go forward to prosecution? If you prosecute, does the case actually make it to court? Because an awful lot of cases are what we call cracked, right? They don't actually make it to court, right? Now, that process from being reported by a victim to an eventual conviction, because once you've got to court, you've then got to get a conviction. Yeah. So that process, you have a lot of cases falling out. Now, generally speaking, the attrition rate on crime is actually relatively high. So for, if you wanted to take like all different crime categories, the attrition rate is going to sit at around 30%. Okay. Yeah. So it happens for a variety of reasons. Rape and sexual assaults have the highest attrition rate of all crimes. The attrition rate for rape sits somewhere in the high 90s most of the time. Yeah.
High 90s?
High 90s, yeah. So a few years ago, the Center for Women's Justice did a report, and at that point, there was a 98.2% attrition rate, which meant out of every 100 cases that got reported, only 1.8 ended in a conviction. Right?
And these are the ones we know about.
These are the ones we know about, because the other thing about rape and sexual assaults is they are the least reported of all crimes for all sorts of reasons. So with this report, when I saw it's the 95.6%, I think, or 95.4%, but the attrition rate for these cases is in line with the national average for sexual violence and rape. Now, that's quite alarming to me, right? And it's alarming to me for a couple of reasons. So if you think it through, we've got 2,088 rapes that took place somewhere on hospital premises. So you've got a victim, and let's just make her a 24-year-old woman who has gone in for some treatment for breast cancer, let's say, for the sake of argument. So she's there, maybe she's an overnight, staying in overnight. And at some point in her stay, she's raped by, let's just make this person a porter, right? She knows she's been raped. Yeah, if she was conscious. So she knows she's been raped. She reports it to the police. One of the reasons that we have a high attrition rate for rape and sexual violence is because of the quote unquote blurry line with consent. Yeah. So if it's your husband, your ex-husband, your boyfriend, the police might say, "Are you sure it was rape? Are you really sure?" We haven't got the evidence, right? Now, the police have to, when prosecuting rape cases or investigating them, they have to collect what is called undermining evidence, right? And this is where we see a lot of the cases fall out of the system for sex workers, prostituted women, children who are being sexually exploited, because their Facebook pages can be gone through. All the records that they've had with social services can be combed through. So if the police then find that the individual is somebody who's troublesome, who may have reported rape before, who has had, a drug and alcohol past, who has had a criminal past, well, that can then be used against the victim's credibility. This is not the case for people in hospital.
No.
The women and children and, some of the men and boys that have been violated in hospitals, they're violated by someone they don't know, right? But also, they're not what you would call and I use this with your listeners won't be able to see the rabbit ears, but the scare quotes. I use this, very carefully. The people in hospitals are those who are likely to conform to our ideal, typical notions of who a victim of sexual violence is, right? In that circumstance, that we see such a high attrition rate is really quite worrying. Really quite worrying. So we don't know at what point these cases fall out. We don't, we know that they don't end up in a charge or a summons, but we don't know why. We haven't had a study of it. We know nothing about why that attrition rate is so high in this instance. And it's actually very important that we begin to understand that, again, if we're going to do anything about it.
And the percentage that we have for charged or summoned is 4.1%.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. But we don't know anything after that.
No.
Okay.
Nothing. And arguably the police may not have that information. Do you know what I mean? We have to start going to courts, CPS. There's other sources of information to be able to provide that. But that's kind of like the next step.
Yes.
In this is we need to really get much better and much more detailed data.
I wonder at that why that's the case. My first instinct was something about reputation protection of hospitals or incompetence or ambivalence.
Yeah. Or let's see if we can make the problem go away by putting the person that we know is a rapist on administrative leave and then moving them to somewhere else in the hospital. Or, and I suspect we'll see a lot of this once we can get underneath the bonnet of all of this stuff. Or it may be, well, the person actually suffers from dementia. Yeah. Or, well, the person was actually on narcotic drugs. Because they've just had, I don't know, horrible surgery, or it may be actually these things are taking place in mental health wards, and of course the person may be a little bit quote unquote crazy. So all of those things that could undermine a victim's credibility. But here's where that idea falls apart, right? And I'm just turning to the actual report. Rape of an under 13-year-old, 3 rapes of under 16-year-olds, 6 rapes of girls under the age of 13, rape of someone, of a girl over the age of 16 by multiple assailants. I mean, I would like to, those cases, if they have been attritioned, that's a real worry, a real worry. So the data that we've got is really just a start. We need to know a lot more, and we need, as we've said in the report, for the police and the NHS trusts to take it much more seriously. There's another question. We actually need to get under the bonnet of what's happening in our private hospitals as well.
Sure.
Yeah. We need to see how this patterns out in the private hospitals as well as the NHS ones.
And the private hospitals are also inspected by the same CQC than the NHS hospitals. So they're held to the same standards across the board for all sorts of things.
Yep.
But is there anything stopping us knowing as much about them as NHS? Because one's public and one's private. No good reason why we shouldn't be able to dig down and find out. Okay.
Nope. But, one of the trying to find things like staffing levels, because, there's going to be all sorts of things that affect this. Like in the experience that I gave you, there was no female member of staff who could take me to the toilet that day. And, just imagine if that person who did take me to the toilet was a predator. Because we have this, this is the other thing. And it's very easy to paint these people who are doing these horrendous violations as somehow other. Do you know what I mean? They would look different, or they'd appear different, or they're not the people who are doing the good work and the real work. They're not the angels, they're the devils, or however you want to paint all of that. But the simple fact is, after 26 years of working in this area, sexual violence and sexual assaults are so routine. It could be anybody. I mean, anybody. We know from within the report that some of these sexual violences took place in clinical settings. Right? I don't even know what that means, to be quite frank. But one person did email and said that they realized again, since the report was launched, that they realized that they were suffering a fairly serious sexual assault as they were coming to from anesthetics. The only person who has access to an individual who is in, the care room after a surgery is nursing staff and porters. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, there aren't visitors walking in and out. No. I
mean, there never were, and certainly during COVID times there wouldn't be, because those are very particular places in a hospital, aren't they?
And this did take place during COVID, and I've heard you mention this when asked, but I think it's worth covering here again. There's a couple of aspects to this, aren't there? There were far fewer people going into hospitals as visitors, etc. And fewer patients were in hospitals during the pandemic, but the members of staff were head to toe in PPE and wearing masks and face visors and full aprons, and no badges could be seen.
Yeah, well, quite. So it raises all sorts of questions. Does this mean that the people who perpetrated these violences were hospital staff, or actually, did the multiple assailants to that poor girl who was raped, were they actually people from the outside but walking in with protective gear? We really don't know. It was an extraordinary time, the COVID times. We don't know what effect it's had on those stats. We could, and a really interesting project would be to track all of this. If we could get the police and the hospitals to clean up how they present this data, if we could track it for another few years, and this isn't for some idle academic exercise, but we could begin to understand a little bit more about the effect of things like staffing, the effect of things like CCTV, the effect of things of changing policies. And we could actually begin to see how we can prevent the sexual violence rather than keep people sexually safe.
Yes.
Sorry.
That term is still just making me go, oh, yeah,
I know.
Bizarre. How has the report been received?
Well, that has really taken me by surprise, because it's, I just keep using the term and forgive the gallows humor with this. We have liftoff. There have been more retweets, tweets, emails, calls from the media. This has actually really hit, which is both really happy, and I'm kind of sad about a few things because we're not the first people to report this. So it's like, why didn't it hit before? That's fine. It's hitting now, because what we need is the issue changed. And yet, I mean, I lurk on Twitter quite a bit. I saw somebody on Twitter, and I won't mention their Twitter handle. They are another academic, I have to say, though. Say, well, there are 55 million patients who go through the NHS. So that the fact that there's been, 6,000 rapes for sexual assaults, that's a tiny percentage. So, why should we bother? Right? And I'm just like, what? How many is an acceptable level? So that was one thread of kind of ill reaction that really disturbed me, because I'm sure that individual isn't alone in thinking that, okay, yeah, only 6,000, who really cares? But there's another thread that disturbs me greatly, and this is, I'm not being political about this, and that's but you're all being transphobic. Right, thread, and that's more present on Twitter, I think, than I've seen anywhere else. I haven't received the usual hate mail that I get in my email inbox, and that one goes along this lines. Well, you're asking for for hospitals to consider single-sex provision. You want to record the sex of offenders and the sex of victims. That's transphobic. And where would you want the trans individuals going within this system? Now, okay, there's an issue here, and we do need to take that seriously. However, we need to just get some clean data and clean policies, and then work out the complications and all of that a little bit later down the line. But to try and kind of attack the report on the grounds that it is transphobic for these matters is, in my mind, the tail wagging the dog, quite frankly.
And the whole point of safeguarding, you only know how to do safeguarding well if you have the data. And safeguarding protects everybody. Absolutely.
I mean, I couldn't put it better myself. That is absolutely the case. But safeguarding doesn't mean that you take gender identity and prioritize it over biological sex, because this is the one area, and I can say this with 26 years of experience, right, and the title of professor before my name, this is the one area where 200 years worth of robust criminological and sociological evidence will tell you sexual violence is, on the whole, a male problem.
Yeah.
And a female, women are victimized, disproportionately, massively. 98% of sexual offenders are male.
And under UK law, rape is such that it has to be a male perpetrator?
Yeah, you have to have a penis.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to have a penis.
But as you've pointed out, there's quite a lot of data missing, and you have mentioned a few different kind of calls to action. So I thought it might be quite useful to just summarize that. What can we do organizational level, and then any listeners to this podcast, what can they do as individuals?
Organizationally, the work of Women's Rights Network needs to continue. These FOIs need to continue. If the police aren't willing to provide this data up front, then we need to keep holding them to account. And it isn't just making the same FOIs repeatedly. We need to start FOIing, well, what was the sex? What happened? We need to figure out what happened with the 95.9 that fell out of the system. On what grounds was there no charge or summons? So a lot more FOIs need to happen. We need to hold to account the police forces that refused these FOIs. So we need the data from Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Some big gaps there in the data.
Some really big gaps. Organizations at the local and county level can look at what's happening in their local level, and start asking questions of the NHS trust foundations and their own police forces, and getting the message out to local radio stations as well, and making people aware where their police force and NHS trust is in this. Now, I just want to add a tiny thing. Just because there's a very high number that's been reported does not necessarily mean that that area, that police force, has a higher level of rape and sexual violence, right? Because all it means is that a higher number are being reported. So where you see, for instance, I think it was Durham, has a very low number, right? I want to say it was either 1 or 15. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a very single figures, or double figures, tiny number. Now, that doesn't mean that the hospitals in that area don't have a problem with rape and sexual violence. It means they might have a problem with reporting and recording.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah.
So some of this is, for local organizations to actually get underneath, I've used the phrase underneath the bonnet, try and understand what that number for their local authority is. So that's one thing that can happen. The listeners to your program, I think, to get behind the campaign to hold all of those in office, whether it's in healthcare settings or whether it's our government, to get behind getting better data and beginning to change policies. I think there needs to be a really, really big campaign about reframing any NHS Foundation trust that has a sexual safety policy. Those policies need to include an outline of the Sex Offences Act 2003. Right? It's really simple, really simple. Devon Foundation Trust does that. You read their policy, and the first thing that happens is, sexual assaults are a crime. Yeah, this is the law, and it outlines every single form of sex offense that you can get. So to have a policy from an NHS Foundation Trust that doesn't frame it in terms of safeguarding, but actually, here's the law on sexual violence, and this is how we're going to support victims of it, I think is a really important, campaign that we might want to think about.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I am exceedingly grateful to the Women's Rights Network for all sorts of things. I'm exceedingly grateful for them actually doing the hard, bloody graft.
All volunteers, aren't they? They're all volunteers.
Yeah, all volunteers. And what an amazing job. I know other people have reported it before, but this one has landed for whatever reason, and it's landed off the back of volunteer work. And, we really need to acknowledge that. I also personally want to thank the members of the Women's Research Network, and indeed Heather, because several of you reached out to me when I was having an exceedingly dark time in my life, when I was being run out of the OU. I had PTSD as a result of it, and I was, to put it quite frankly, scared. And not scared because I was worried about somebody coming at me with a knife. I was scared for my professional future. And also I had lost my academic community as a result of what my detractors did to me at the Open University. And Women's Rights Network was one of the organizations that helped me find a new community. So I am exceedingly grateful.
And I would encourage any woman who feels that she's in a place where she just can't talk to others about any of these relevant issues, or wants to get involved, is jumping at the bit to do things. If you're not already a member of the Women's Rights Network, you can go to womensrights.network online and contact us. And you'll be very welcome to join us, where we have wonderful members like Professor Joe Phoenix. Would you like to remind us one last time about your crowdfunder?
Yes, so I am taking the Open University to an employment tribunal on the basis of discrimination, harassment, and constructive dismissal. I have raised, it sounds like an extraordinary amount of money. I've raised, or people have donated, rather, £144,000 already. I have to get to £180,000 minimum. Okay. It costs an awful lot of money to do this work, and I'll just say one thing. The Open University have provided nearly 5,000 pages of evidence and disclosure. Those are pages that my legal team and I have to read, digest, and figure out. This is a very expensive case, but it's a very important one, because if I win, it sets the line in the sand between academic freedom and harassment and victimization. And that's something we really need at this point in time.
Yeah, it's absolutely fundamental.
Mm.
Professor Jo Phoenix, thank you very much.